Hey, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Cody Ennis with the Department of Ecology. I'm the Duwamish Stormwater Compliance Specialist, and before my promotion to the Duwamish Stormwater Compliance Specialist, I was an inspector for ecology in King and Snohomish counties. So my territory grew a little bit smaller just for the Duwamish River, but no less inspections and no less fun stormwater to go and find. And so as far as as far as stormwater inspections go, you know, what does an inspection look like? What do you expect when you're inspecting? And so, what happens during an inspection? What are we looking for? What's going on? And so we're essentially trying to view what a site is in a snapshot. And so you're at your site, daily, or you know your site better than we do. And so our purpose for going out and doing inspections is to be the eyes and the ears of the Department of Ecology, to learn what's happening at the site, and to also provide, compliance assistance, technical assistance, and general knowledge as well. But to go into the anatomy of an inspection, it's a pretty simple anatomy, just three parts. We meet and talk about the paperwork. We do the actual site walk, and then most times we'll do an inspection debrief. And so the discussion and paperwork is still very important with regards to the site walk. And so that's typically how I conduct my inspections. Is I'll go to the facility, and if I haven't reviewed their documents before, I'll be like, okay, let's sit down before we do any site walks. I'll need to see your stormwater prevention or pollution prevention plan. I'll need to see some spill logs, and then all the generally required documents on site. And so then, of course, we'll do the site walk, and then the inspection debrief. And like I said, most of the time we'll do this, but sometimes the either the facility won't want to, or we've done the inspection in such a way that we don't need to do the inspection debrief. But I always recommend asking your inspector, hey, once we're done with the main inspection, can we sit down? Can we talk? And then compare notes. During inspections, a lot of talking is happening, a lot of information is getting shared. And so I'm taking notes, I'm taking photos of things that are interesting, for my inspection. And you should be taking notes too. And if I've seen many times at going to facilities, I'll take a picture of something, and the operator or whoever is escorting me around the site will take a picture of the same thing I just did, just for their reference. And so for the site walk, much of what we're doing is trying to see what best management practices are in place and how they're maintained. And so for this photo right here, this is they're doing woodwork products, or making wooden products, and this conveyor belt is being fed by a hopper, and so it's got wood debris and waste. And part of their best management practices were to have a tray underneath it to collect any debris that may fall off. The conveyor belt's covered over here, and so it's got the best management practices, or the key pieces already there. But with a lack of maintenance and a lack of attention, the BMPs have failed, and the stormwater is being affected by wood waste, debris, and dust. And so that's what a lot of what we're looking for is, just to see what best management practices are in place, and which ones are working, which ones need more attention, or which ones just haven't been maintained. And so this is the inside of an oil water separator, and the best management practice for cleaning out the separator for this particular site was to have an employee go in and scoop out the sludge into the bucket shown in the picture. And then once the coalescing plates were too clogged, they were pulled out of the separator and then pressure washed in the same stormwater system that feeds into the oil water separator. And so the equipment was here, but the best management practices were not being maintained, and even having incorrect best management practices. And so, as part of my job as an inspector, is to see these practices implemented, and then to provide guidance on whether or not it's like, hey, your practices are doing great, or they need work, or you're not doing this practice right at all. And this is the effluent stream from that same oil water separator. And so, as part of the facility's responsibilities for the industrial stormwater general permit, is to do monthly inspections. And so they, you should be looking at all parts of your stormwater at least once a month. And if the facility that was looking at this infrastructure was, if they were more informed or knew how to how to properly maintain their oil water separator, they would know that this effluent stream does not look good. This would cause some issues on a monthly inspection. And so moving on to another best management practice, this is ostensibly a picture of blackberries, but I promise there's stormwater infrastructure underneath the blackberries. There are 3 retention ponds, or excuse me, not retention, detention ponds. And I'd asked the operator of this facility, I said, hey, have you ever seen these ponds overflow? And of course they say, no, I've never seen it overflow. And I'm like, do you know if it has an overflow port? And they just, well, not really sure. And so I was prepared for this inspection. I had my machete, I had some leather gloves and some leg protection, and I was ready to go out and do some bushwhacking to go and find that outfall pipe. But thankfully, they were kind enough to get a material mover to remove the blackberries, and so I was able to find their outfall pipe. So they haven't had overflows because it was just overflowing out the outfall pipe. And so that leads me to common issues that I see on sites. And so the best management practices that aren't excuse me, best management practices or BMPs are not maintained. That's, so open dumpsters, almost every facility I go to has dumpsters that either their lids are open and nobody's using them, or they don't have lids and they have no cover at all. Stormwater infrastructure, like the ponds that I showed earlier, being overgrown, that's a pretty common one as well. Um, Secondary containment for chemical containers. I go to a lot of facilities and I'll see either old drums in a forgotten corner, or I'll see new shipments of brand new product that, somebody just hadn't had time to deal with at that moment. And so that becomes a secondary containment issue. And then another thing that I come across often is I will see a storm drain or trench drain or something on site, and I'll ask whoever's with me, who's showing me around site, it's like, hey, where does this catch basin go? Where does this trench drain go? And if they've got it documented or they know their site, they'd be like, oh, it should go to, or it might be on this drainage basin. But my point is that I go to a lot of places and there's just a general lack of knowledge on certain parts of the stormwater infrastructure. And then another common issue that I see is just lack of documentation for BMPs that are already being done. So an example, vacuum sweeping is required to take place once per quarter, but there are some facilities that they either own or they rent the vacuum sweepers, and so they do it either daily or weekly. And so I can look at the ground and see that there's not an accumulation of dust, but if I can't find, or if there's not a log to be reproduced during the inspection that says, hey, we vacuum swept on these days, these times, then I kind of just have to take the operator's word at it, and there's no real paper trail that I can prove, or that the facility can show, hey, we've been doing what's required. And so that's a common issue that I see, is just lack of documentation for things that are already happening. So if you're doing monthly inspections, or if you're doing or if you're taking note of spills, or if you're already doing vacuum sweeping, you're already doing 90% of the required work. It's just that we need to see it written down. And so when it's written down, we have automatic proof that it's being done. And so here's an example of forgotten drums. Everybody's seen some metal drums, 55 gallons. This one is strapped to an old wooden pallet, and just from the appearance of everything, it looks like they've either been outside for a while, or they're old and then they're just forgotten in this corner. But the problem with this picture is that it's outside. There's no obvious containment for the drums, and there's no empty labels on them. So I don't know what's in them besides what's written on the deteriorated labels, and I have to assume that anything that's in them is a potential to contaminate stormwater, and so that's why it's required for secondary containment. And so then going into the common issues and how to fix them, lack of documentation for the infrastructure, like where does that trench drain go? And so I brought this issue up specifically because when I ask where does this trench drain go, or where does this catch basin go, a lot of times the follow-up question that I'll receive from the facility is, how do I find that out? And my answer is, look through your existing maps and infrastructure as built. Those have a lot of information in them. If you just don't have any documentation, a great place to start is your local municipality or county government. A lot of the local governments have access to GIS mapping as specifically for stormwater drainage. And so they can usually provide assistance for that. And then inspecting your own infrastructure, again, you're at your site the most often. You know your site better than anybody else from either local governments or the state governments or even federal government. You're at your site more than us, so you know what's happening. So yeah, if you see something at your site and what is this? Write it down as something to follow up for. You can even die test your infrastructure as long as you let the county know or let ecology know. That way we don't get or when or if we get complaints, it's like the river's been dyed green. We know why it's been dyed green. And then if just there's no other options to figure out what your infrastructure is or where it's going, there are services, there are technologies that can be used to scope out or remote sense your infrastructure. And so I can't get too much further into third party services or recommending equipment, but I just state that just to bring to your attention that this does exist. There are services out there and there are technologies that can be used to find pipes that are several feet under the ground. And then just going on to the theme of common issues and how to fix them, a lack of secondary containment. An idea that I've seen or I've yeah, ideas that I've seen on sites are extra containment pallets for unexpected deliveries. I've been to a site where they had nice, neat 55-gallon drums with, DEF boxes stacked right on top of them, diesel exhaust fluid boxes. And I told the operator, I'm like, hey, I know these look like they were just delivered, but they need to be delivered to a place that either has secondary containment already, or someone needs to be aware that this delivery was or the shipment was delivered, and it needs to be in the process of being moved to secondary containment. And so I've seen some facilities with just extra containment pallets. And so if you get an unexpected delivery, you can, just bring that out, and it's containment for that moment until you can find a more permanent solution, or designated containment areas with berms and solid floors. I've seen, or I've been to some facilities where I've told them about the secondary containment requirements, and then it's like, well, what do I do with the 3 foot tall pallets? I don't want to have to pick up full 55-gallon drums off of those tall pallets. What do I do? And so you can make a containment area. You can have a solid floored area with a berm. And I think I just did some napkin math earlier today. If you have a 10 by 10 square, or if you have a 10 by 10 foot square, and you do an inch of berm, you've just created about 60 gallons of
Yeah.
secondary containment. And then, there we go. And then another thing, almost every facility I go to, open dumpsters. There's a few solutions to open dumpsters. Equip the dumpsters with lids. That way, whenever you need to toss something, you just open it, close it back down when you're done. Or if your dumpsters are too large, or just something about your operation keeps the dumpster's lids from being closed back, provide cover. I've seen plenty of dumpsters with like a pole barn erected right above it, or some sort of permanent structure uh, above the the dumpsters just to keep the stormwater from going in there. And I say no tarps because I have also seen dumpsters with tarps, and I've had to point into the permit language that says specifically tarps do not count as storm resistant covers for dumpsters. And so this is just an example of a dye test that I did a few months ago. This was a facility where they'd applied for a a conditional no exposure exemption, which is another part of the ISGP. But in due diligence, I was trying to figure out if they even qualified. And so this dye test was done at their one storm drain, and this is the inside view of the combined sewer. And so this particular place, their stormwater went to a combined service, combined sewer, combined sewer. I forget what CSS stands for, but combined sewer essentially. And so that meant that they didn't qualify for the ISGP or the conditional no exposure exemption. And so they have no permit coverage because it's not required because their stormwater does not go to surface waters of the state. And so examples of BMP successes, it's like I like to show, things that I see that are, common issues, but also like to highlight some things that facilities have done well, or something that it surprised me, or I was just like, oh wow, that's great. And so as I don't know how many people are in this audience are aware, but we've entered into the new permit cycle for the industrial stormwater general permit, and with that was a new rule for covering tires. And so I included this picture right here just because they were already ahead of the game on the rule, and I just thought this was a really clever solution for covering tires. And so this facility, they had already done it, but they knew they had told me we knew that tire storage was going to be a problem eventually, and so they just went ahead and were proactive about it and started getting on top of the problem. And then on the right-hand picture, you have a trench drain with at least two or one mat of rubber coating, or one rubber mat covering the trench drain to protect the trench drain from the activity that this worker is doing right here. I believe they're shaving off or deburring a newly galvanized hand railing. And so it's being held up by this forklift just out of frame, and they've got covers over the trench drain to keep the zinc from going into the trench drain. And so I thought that, that's just a good example of, if you have to do an activity in an area that would have impacts on stormwater, there are best management practices and materials that you can use to minimize your effects on the stormwater. And then this is an example of a secondary containment and a spill kit all in one for used materials. This is an all-in-one used material handler and spill kit. A facility uh, made this, and I don't or Ecology doesn't expect any facilities to make their spill kits and their containment areas, but it's just a really interesting example of one that I've seen before. And so yeah, this was a great idea. And then for facilities that don't have the ability to make their own storage containers, like that one, this is, I believe, a Connex box that was converted into a secondary containment, and it's even got the number listed of its containment value. Either, I can't remember specifically from this site visit, but it's either got the max amount it should hold or the containment it can hold. I'd have to go and ask the facility, but this is an example of a more achievable, less expensive option than the previous slide. And then moving from best management practices more towards um, facility practices is discharges to ground. I've heard a lot of facilities are interested in looking into discharges to ground, and one reason, there's multiple reasons why facilities would want to, but one reason is the ISGP doesn't require facilities to sample if they're discharging to ground. But then you also need to keep in mind that there are other requirements for discharges to ground besides what's already in the ISGP. And so if you've got like a French drain, or if you've dug down into the ground to then have a perforated containment, then just leach the water into the soil, that would be an example of underground injection control. And then, so you would also, on top of having the ISGP, you would need to contact Ecology's UIC program to get that same discharge under their permit as well. And then as far as who needs to sample discharges to ground, you'd be like, Cody, you just said if you discharge to ground, we don't need to sample. You would be correct, except for that we are now in the new permit cycle for the ISGP, where we've included the PFAS, just that class of chemicals. So any facility with a certain activity, so think transfer stations or landfills or anything that handles waste in that nature, they will now begin to start sampling for PFAS, even though they are discharging to ground. So that is an exception to that general rule that I had stated earlier. And so just an example of a discharge to ground, it's a pond. It's, it's not super exciting. There's a little discharge pipe right here, and then, you have the pond right here, and I'm standing, while taking this picture, I'm standing on top of a concrete block that used to have a pump house in it, but now this is just used for infiltration purposes. And so challenges to discharge to ground, what's an allowable discharge to ground? Under the ISGP, only stormwater can be discharged to ground. Ecology manages other permits that allow processed wastewater to be discharged to ground, but not the ISGP. So only stormwater can be discharged to the ground. And so another challenge for discharge to ground is hidden overflows and discharges. I've for many of the sites that I've been to, I'll find their infiltration, or not find, we'll go to their infiltration pond, and then I'll ask them, has it ever overflowed? And a lot of the times I'll get the answer of no, it's never overflowed. I've been working here 11, 15 years and I've never seen it overflow. And we'll do some investigation, and a lot of times the infiltration pond will have an overflow pipe. And then some other challenges are nearby surface waters. If you've got a river or a creek or a pond right next to your facility, and you say, oh, well, I want to infiltrate, the groundwater is already probably going to be pretty high, and you're not going to get a lot of infiltration capacity. And so that's something that you need to understand when trying to go for discharges to ground is, the intentionality of it and designing the structure to be able to infiltrate what you're trying to do. And of course, BMPs and maintenance. Infiltration ponds are infrastructure, just like anything else, and they need maintenance for several reasons. And so this is an example of another infiltration pond where it's got a lot of vegetative overgrowth. It's got a it's it's supposed to be an infiltration pond, and at this same pond I asked the operator, hey, has this ever overflowed? And they said no, it's never overflowed. And so I got down there onto the banks of the pond, and it's a little hard to see, but right where my red laser pointer is, there's a 2.5 inch, almost 3 inch PVC pipe sticking out that I suspected at the time was an overflow pipe. And so I documented that, let them know in my inspection report, and then that became a follow-up item for the facility to go and figure out what that pipe was, if it was an overflow pipe or not. And so, yeah, tools to meet these challenges, keep the BMPs maintained. If your ponds or if your stormwater infrastructure infiltration if it's not designed to have plants or vegetative growth in it, then it needs to be maintained to keep that vegetative growth out of it. Plants can do a lot of wonderful things for our stormwater, but only when we're wanting them to, or we're designing the infrastructure to do. There's some times where plant growth in infiltration ponds is a bad thing because a plant can go in there and its roots can pierce either critical infrastructure or pierce liners that weren't designed to be pierced. And then, yeah, that just goes into discharges to ground need to be intentional and planned for. And so it's not, if you're having stormwater difficulties on site, And she's like, well, hey, in order to cut down on the amount of stormwater that leaves our site, we can just go and make a rainwater garden on this bit of unused land, which is a great idea, but it needs to be designed for. It can't be a spur of the moment thing. You need to plan for how much stormwater is going into it. You need to have a maintenance schedule for that stormwater pond because silt and other small fine solids will reduce the infiltration capabilities over time, and so it needs to be maintained. And then moving from the discharges to ground, another challenge for the ISGP is process water. And what is process water? Process water is, there's an ISGP definition for it, but in general, process water is any water that comes into contact with or is used as part of the industrial activity on site. And so this picture right here, I thought and was told at the time was a industrial chiller condensate discharge, which is part of the non-stormwater allowable, conditionally authorized or conditionally allowed stormwater discharge. I got that sentence all mixed up. Basically, what I was trying to say is that it's not stormwater, but since it's not a process water, it's also conditionally allowed. But upon further inspection of this discharge and further digging, we discovered that it was actually non-contact cooling water from a from an industrial refrigerator. And so this seemingly harmless discharge of water turned from a conditionally allowable non-stormwater discharge into a process water discharge, which is an illicit discharge. And so that's a long way of saying that we didn't know what this was. We thought it was okay, but then we dug into it and then it turned out to be not okay at all. And so here is the textbook definition of processed water. I don't want to read that out to you, but it is available in the ISGP for reference. And so on an inspection, whenever whenever we see something and we're just like, oh well, that's an illicit discharge, and sometimes we'll get the response of it's just water. And while that may technically be true in that specific instance, there are many times where that water is picking up things that we don't know about, that we in this picture right here, we've got a washing machine test bench. And so this facility is restoring or recycling washing machines, and as part of their process, they are testing them. They're not using soap. I don't think they've even got dirty clothes in these washing machines. They're just running them to see if they go through the cycle. But the problem is that their discharge line for all of the stormwater was being discharged right there onto the ground. And so at this specific facility, we asked them to stop the washing machine test bench, and we essentially told them, hey, this is an illicit discharge. You need to figure out something else to do with your process wastewater. And I should have included the picture here, but I don't. They basically cut this line right here, and they either purchased or rented a large portable, not potable, different word, a large portable water tank, and they stored their process water there until they could dispose of it properly at that time. And so, like I said, a challenge of determining or a challenge of process water is it process water at all? And then, accessing the process water properly and then mistaking seamlessly harmless discharges for allowable discharge. And so the tools to handle process water is if it's not stormwater, treat it as a process wastewater and don't discharge it until you do the investigation of, oh, well, this isn't stormwater, but it's not a process wastewater. Does it fit in ecology or the ISGP's list of non-stormwater allowable discharges? And so that's just a good practice of managing that. And then, yeah, be aware of wash water. So when I say wash water, I mean vehicle washing, equipment washing, any sort of washing intended to remove debris from equipment. That water is considered process wastewater. And so you need to handle that wash water as if it was another industrial process water. It can't go into the storm drain. You need to control for overspray, and generally, just be cognizant of keeping that wash water or process water from mixing with the storm water. And then, of course, documenting any known sources of non-stormwater discharges. That way, if you've already done the inspection or the legwork on how to, or what if this is processed water or not processed water, document it so the next person doesn't have to do the same thing, in case you get promoted or you take another job. We all know turnover happens all the time. And so documentation of any known sources helps keep that institutional knowledge in your facility, and that way you or the next person doesn't have to do that inspection again. And then enforcement and assistance. What happens, when an inspector's at a site? Is an inspector going to do? When is it appropriate for enforcement, and when is it appropriate for assistance? But the biggest question is, what is the inspector's goal? And for all the sites or most of the inspections that I've been on, my goal has been to see the site conditions, see if there's any work that needs to be done on improving those site conditions, and if there's anything I can do to help the facility gain compliance. So that was a long way of saying that my goal is compliance with the permit and protection of the environment and human health. And so I don't want to go onto a site and, just crack heads together and immediately make it a bad time for everybody. I want the facility to work with me, and I want to work with the facility so that we can both work towards the same thing, which is permit compliance and ultimately, keeping less pollutants out of the environment. And so when does an inspector determine technical assistance is appropriate? Every time. Every time is appropriate for technical assistance. The only time when enforcement starts to become a thought is if we see something truly egregious, or if there is a long history of non-compliance, or just generally not listening to ecology or the inspector on what needs to be done. So if I've gone to a place, and I'm just making up examples, if I've gone to a place, 3 or 4 times and I keep seeing the same issues over and over again, that's going to factor into my recommendation to management of, hey, I've been to this place, I've offered them assistance. They don't seem to be either taking my assistance or they're not implementing it correctly. I recommend, we go to enforcement then. And so when does an inspector determine when enforcement is appropriate? Hopefully an inspector in the field will not determine right then and there if enforcement's appropriate, because it's a bit more than our call. We make recommendations for enforcement. And also if we say that enforcement is or is not going to happen in the field, then that can create issues later. And so if you ask your inspector, oh, are we going to get fines for this? Are we going to get more enforcement for this? Their answer is most likely going to be a non-answer, which I understand is frustrating, but the inspector's more focused on doing the inspection, providing any technical assistance as needed or if asked for, and then, just worried about getting the inspection done and getting as much knowledge passed over as possible. So again, we're not looking to get on site with our big fine books and, just start writing tickets immediately. It's more, we want the facility to have the tools to succeed, and to, if there are fines, we would rather the facility spend that money on fixing the problems rather than spending the money on the fines. And so um, my at least for me, and a lot of other inspectors do share this, but we generally try and go for technical assistance and compliance assistance rather than enforcement, just because it gets the same results, and it's less steps, it's less difficult for ecology, and it's less stressful for the facility if we have a working relationship. And the facility calls and asks us questions, or the facility says, hey, we're having this big problem. Have you seen any ideas? Ecology is going to be a lot more receptive to that rather than, we had a big problem and we tried to hide it, or we tried to figure it out on our own, but we didn't have the tools or knowledge needed. That would be a little bit different scenario for that. But that is the end of my presentation. And so I'm sure I had a whole bunch of information that I talked about. And if anybody has any questions, they're more than welcome to ask at this point.